Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about electrical conduction down neurons. In short, here's our typical neuron that we've been looking at: dendrite, cell body, axon, axon terminals, and the goal is to release neurotransmitters via exocytosis. Now, one thing we've talked about in the cell body, that the graded potential is variable in strength. That is to say, we can get a stimulus and that electrical activity will quickly start dissipating and we lose voltage or charge as it moves across the cell membrane. So as we move from here to the axon hillock, we start losing voltage. And that has everything to do with what's known as current leakage, or specifically potassium leakage. That is to say, there are potassium leakage channels peppered around the cell membrane. And truth be known, there's leakage channels on many cells in the body, sodium leakage channels allowing sodium to leak into cells, and potassium leakage channels allowing potassium to leak out of cells. There tends to be more potassium leakage channels in cells than sodium leakage channels. More potassium leaks out of the cell, that keeps the cell interior negative, and that's really what we're striving for in the resting state. But if we're trying to depolarize this cell body to get to threshold at the axon hillock, we have a problem because there's a bunch of current leak, or specifically potassium leakage, out of the cell. And as positively charged ions, as cations depart from the cell, they're taking away from the positivity of the cell. They're taking away from that depolarization. So that's why we need a strong enough stimulus to overcome this current leak. That same potassium leakage is theoretically a problem along the axon as well, but there's a mechanism that neurons utilize to minimize potassium leakage. And those are what are known as myelin sheaths. And that's what you see here in blue. These are myelin sheaths in the central nervous system. They would be created by oligodendrocytes. In the peripheral nervous system, they would be created by Schwann cells. These myelin sheaths are created by myelin, which is a lipid that insulates the axon and prevents current leak or potassium leakage from the axon. As a result, it maintains the voltage of the axon much more than we saw in the cell body. And myelination increases the propagation of the action potential down the axon. Once again, in these gaps between the myelin sheaths, which we refer to as the nodes of Ranvier, there would be some potassium leakage here, but there's going to be so many sodium ion channels, specifically voltage-gated sodium ion channels, that it will overcome the potassium leakage. So in a previous slide, we had seen, or I had drawn, a bunch of voltage-gated sodium ion channels along this whole axon. But that, truth be known, is unrealistic. Those voltage-gated sodium ion channels are only at the nodes. And what the myelin sheaths allow for is that electrical activity jumps from one node of Ranvier to the next node of Ranvier, and that's where they are activating the voltage-gated sodium channels. The myelin sheaths achieve two things, which are really two sides of the same coin. They increase conduction speed because the voltage jumps from one node to the next, rather than having to depolarize every square inch of this axon. And they also prevent potassium leakage out of the cell. By preventing potassium leakage out of the cell, they will then allow for maintenance of the depolarization event. So if we look here, in red, I have, these are the voltage-gated sodium channels that would be between the nodes of Ranvier. Certainly they would be on both sides of the axon, but for sake of this lecture, I'm just putting them on this. Once again, here's the graded potential that is losing strength across the cell body. And it's losing strength because of the potassium leakage. It's also losing strength due to something known as cytoplasmic resistance, the resistance that the cytosol creates against the progression of that depolarization event. But really what we're focusing on here is potassium leakage. That's a significant factor why this is losing strength over distance.